Let's review the effect of a tariff and a quota again. We begin with our supply and demand curve. This would be for the domestic market. So we have domestic supply, we have the demand curve within the domestic country, and we have an equilibrium price and quantity of $17 and 6,000 pounds. Notice that the quantity is in thousands. Our downward sloping demand curve tells us that there are people who value sugar much higher than others. So, for example, to the left of the equilibrium price of $17, there are people who value sugar at, say, 25 for the 3,000th pound of sugar. To the right of that equilibrium are people who have a value of less than $17. They may have a value of, say, $10 for the 9,000th pound of sugar. On the supply curve, it's upward sloping, representing increasing marginal opportunity cost of resources used to bring sugar to the market, to produce and bring sugar to the market. If we use labor, energy, transportation to get sugar and bring it to the market, those resources can't simultaneously be used elsewhere. And the more sugar we want, that's movement along the supply curve, the fewer other resources we can have, and those resources become increasingly more important to us the more sugar we produce. So that equilibrium tells us that at that 6,000th pound, the marginal opportunity cost of resources needed to produce the 6,000th pound of sugar is exactly equal to the value to the user of that 6,000th pound. We don't want to go to the right of that equilibrium because then the marginal cost of producing beyond 6,000 is greater than the value consumers place on that. The red box represents the total revenue to producers of supplying 6,000 pounds of sugar in the market. Domestic suppliers produce 6,000 pounds. They sell it for $17 a pound. That's $102,000 in total revenue going to the domestic supplier. Consumer surplus is going to be the area above the demand curve, above the price line and below the demand curve. For example, again, looking at the value of, say, the 2,000th pound of sugar may be $25, but that person or company paid only $17 for that sugar, therefore their surplus was $8 for that pound. Now again, someone like a baker or somebody who has fewer alternatives for sugar will be to the left of that supply curve relative to the equilibrium relative to the people to the right of that equilibrium along the demand curve, and that surplus just simply represents how much better off they are relative to the price they paid for sugar. We also have producer surplus. This represents the value to producers above and beyond their marginal cost of producing sugar. So if the price of sugar is $17, which it is in this example, and it only costs them, let's say, $5 to produce the 2,000th pound of sugar, they received $17 for that sugar, so their surplus is $12. To the right of that is the variable cost to producers of producing 6,000 pounds of sugar. In this case here, it's half of the $102,000, so it'd be $51,000. That would include labor costs, energy costs, whatever it is. Remember, variable costs are the sum of marginal costs. So when you add this up, this is the variable cost of producing 6,000 pounds of sugar. So what happens is the producers receive $102,000 per day. We're going to use this on a daily basis. $102,000 per day producing and selling sugar. Half of that goes to cover their marginal cost of production. The other half is surplus. Now again, that surplus isn't necessarily profit. It could go to pay fixed costs or taxes or something like that. If I have an ice cream store and I can produce a cone for another 25 cents and sell it for $2.25, my surplus is $2, but that may be what I have to use to pay rent, to pay energy, to well, actually, the energy would be covered under marginal cost, pay rent, to pay taxes, whatever those fixed costs are. Now, what happens in this market when we open up to free trade? Well, the world price would have to be less than our domestic equilibrium price, or we would not import the good. So this is a good that's being imported. Again, let's say it's sugar. It's $10 a pound on the world market. Therefore, consumers are able to buy more sugar at $10 relative to what they were willing to pay at $17. Therefore, the consumption to consumers goes from 6,000 pounds to 9,000 pounds, and the price, because of the falling price, from 17 to 10. For producers, they decrease their production from 6,000 to 4,000 pounds. Why is that? Because anything above $10 If they go to the right of 4,000, their cost of producing is greater than $10. Consumers have other opportunities to buy sugar, which is $10 off the world market. Therefore, domestic producers won't produce more than 4,000 pounds because they can't sell it at the higher price they need to cover their costs. This would be their total revenue then. Price times quantity is $40,000. Remember, it had been 102 without free trade, so they've lost a lot of revenue. Part of that is in the costs. The rectangle between 4 and 6 and between 0 and $10, and then the triangle above that, that represents their lost or foregone variable costs of producing 4,000 to 6,000 pounds of sugar. That's not a loss to them. But here was their surplus. Now their surplus has decreased because of free trade. They lost that area between $10 and $17, the trapezoidal area between $10 and $17 above producer surplus. Where did that go? Well, that's now consumer surplus. The lower price creates more value for consumers. We've gone from consuming 6,000 to 9,000 pounds of sugar, plus the consumers can now buy sugar for $17. Instead of $17, they'll buy it for $10. Those consumers who would have paid $17 or more now only are paying $10. So consumer surplus expanded. Where did it go? Well, consumer surplus had been A. Producer surplus was B and C. But now, given free trade, producer surplus, they lost B. That is now consumer surplus. That's simply a transfer of wealth. There is no foregone opportunities or welfare there. B simply went from producer surplus. It is now consumer surplus. The gains from free trade or the social advantages come from D and E. D and E represent the following. D represents the lower opportunity cost of resources needed to produce between 4,000 and 6,000 pounds of sugar. Imagine you have a computer programmer who is picking apples. Well, that resource could be utilized more effectively elsewhere, and if we took them away from picking apples and put them behind a computer to make neat programs, we would be better off as a society. Well, the same thing with D. Domestic producers are higher opportunity cost producers of between 4,000 and 6,000 pounds of sugar. If we allow foreigners to do it, they can do it for $10. We are better off. So D is what's called an efficiency gain from free trade. E is the gains from now consumers who valued sugar between $10 and $17. Because the price is now $10, they're able to consume it. This is the gain from expanded consumption of sugar in the domestic market, and it expanded because free trade allowed for a lower price, which meant more people could afford sugar and they would purchase it. What happens now with a tariff? Well, if there's a $4 tariff on each pound of imported sugar, we are a small country in this case. It doesn't have an effect on the price. Therefore, the price goes from $10 to $14 on the world market, or in the domestic market. $10 is the world price for sugar, $4 per pound is the tariff that's imposed by the government, and therefore you have the following that's going to happen. First off, consumers lose surplus. They lost that area, the white area, but below B and below D and E. This surplus is gone because now consumers, instead of paying $10, are having to pay $14 per pound of sugar. F is the increased producer surplus from being able to expand output at the higher price of $14. Remember, they would not produce beyond 4,000 pounds when the price was 10 because their marginal cost of producing, say, the 5,000 pound was too great. But at $14, they will produce it. So they're producing more sugar, their surplus increased. They now produce 5.5 or 5,500 pounds of sugar instead of 4,000, and that makes them better off. Alternatively, consumers reduce their consumption from 9,000 pounds to 7,000 pounds due to the increase in cost to them of obtaining sugar. It's now $14 instead of $10. Here is now the variable cost to domestic producers of producing 5,500 pounds of sugar given this tariff. Notice what G is. We talked about the efficiency gain before. Well, G is now an efficiency loss. Remember, domestic producers could produce between 4,000 and 5,500 pounds of sugar at $10. Domestic producers can't. They are now producing at a higher cost, and that's represented by G, we call that an efficiency loss from tariff. At J is the loss of consumer surplus due to the higher price. Those consumers who valued sugar between $10 and $14 are no longer going to purchase sugar because of that higher price. Therefore, domestic consumption falls from 9,000 to 7,000 pounds. These are the two true welfare losses from having an import tariff or quota that raises the price to domestic consumers. So what is the difference here? Well, H and I are the differences I want to look at. If the tariff is $4 a pound, it went from $10 to $14, and we see that imports decreased from 5,000 pounds to 1.5 or 1,500 pounds, then the tariff revenue is going to be the tariff per pound, which is $4, times 1,500 pounds. So H and I represent tariff revenue to the government. Now I have to ask you, what is that if we were talking about a quota? If we were to impose a quota in this market on 1,000 to 1,500 pounds of sugar imported into this country, everything I've just talked about is the exact same. The price would go up because of the reduced supply of sugar in this market. Consumers would reduce their consumption from 9,000 to 7,000 pounds. The higher cost from the reduced imports coming to this country means domestic producers will produce 5,500 pounds. The only difference is H and I. Since it's no revenue going to the government due to a tariff, I asked you to tell me what H and I would be, and I'll ask that question on Monday. What happens now to our export industries when we open up our markets to free trade? We just talked about the import companies that have to compete with imports. What about companies that export to other parts of the world? Well, this in our original market is consumer surplus. This is producer surplus without trade. But when we trade with the rest of the world price is going to be higher for the export market. We would not sell to other countries unless we got more than we were getting in the domestic market. Therefore, the world price would have to be higher in the export market, and that's represented by the $25 world price. So what happens? Well, at $25, domestic consumers reduce their consumption from 6,000 to 4,000 pounds. Again, let's just assume this is a sugar market again, and the price of sugar went from 17 to 25 in the domestic market because sugar producers are now selling more of their sugar abroad. Therefore, domestic consumers reduce their consumption from 6,000 to 4,000 pounds of sugar. Domestic producers are going to expand their output because they're getting more for each pound of sugar. They're getting $25 instead of 17, so they expand output from 6,000 to 8,000 pounds. Exports are therefore 4,000 pounds, the difference between 8 and 4. Domestic producers are producing 8,000 pounds of sugar. Domestic consumers are consuming 4 of that. The other 4 is being shipped overseas in the export market. Consumer surplus therefore declines. Instead of being A, B, and C as it had been, consumer surplus is now A. It's represented by the area below the demand curve and above the new price line. Producer surplus increased A, B, C. F was already producer surplus. I just had to put that in there to delineate the dotted lines from 17 and between 4 and 6. But producers have picked up B and C, which had been consumer surplus. So again, that's just a transfer from consumers to producers. There is no social loss or social gain. The real gain is in E. That's an area that had not been in play before, and now what that says is domestic producers are receiving surplus in excess of what they had or they had in combination with consumer surplus. So E is a social benefit to domestic suppliers in the export market. Now you can see hopefully how free trade benefits both importers and exporters, consumers and producers in this country. It's just they are different people. Those countries that are competing with imports are made worse off, while those companies that are able to export their goods overseas are made better off. Both are by a greater amount to consumers and to producers.